I sentence you to a life of hard labor.
Imagine being born into a world where your name is never yours. Your labor is owed. Your movement is tracked. Your silence is expected. Not because you committed a crime, but because the law says you're less than a person. Now imagine that no matter how hard you work, no matter how loyal, skilled, or faithful you are, you can never leave. Not by choice, not by money, not even by favor. You are property, not just of a lord, but of a system so deeply embedded in law that even your children and their children are born into chains. When we talk about slavery, we often jump to ancient Rome or colonial America. But there's a disturbing chapter most people skip, medieval Europe, and it's far more brutal than fairy tales and fantasy novels would have you believe. What if I told you that millions of people in medieval villages, people who looked just like their neighbors, were legally enslaved? Not whipped in fields or chained in dungeons, but trapped by invisible shackles made of land, law, and legacy. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on a horrifying reality: how medieval legal systems quietly turned ordinary people into lifelong slaves, and how that system was so cleverly designed, escape wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. This is not a tale of chains and whips. This is a story of a legal trap, one that disguised itself as tradition, twisted faith into control, and locked families into generational bondage for centuries. In medieval Europe, slavery didn't always mean chains and collars. The real trap was quieter, legal, and generational. If your parents were serfs, bound to land, so were you. But this wasn't just custom, it was codified into law. The moment you were born, the local lord essentially owned your body. Not because of a contract, but because of unfree status, a legal designation passed down like a curse. You could be baptized in the village church, speak the same language as the freemen, work beside them in the fields, and still be considered property. Your labor wasn't yours. Every hour you worked helped someone else profit. You couldn't leave the land without permission. You couldn't marry without approval. In some places, even if you escaped to another town, your status followed you, hunted down by law like stolen cattle. And the worst part? Many serfs didn't even realize they were slaves. The system was so normalized that bondage felt like life itself. When slavery disguises itself as tradition, even the enslaved forget they're in chains. This wasn't just a social hierarchy. It was engineered entrapment. Under medieval law, lords had near total control over the people on their land. They could tax your harvest, take part of your livestock, and demand forced labor, called corvée. But if you tried to leave, you were considered a criminal, not just a runaway. In fact, some legal codes allowed lords to brand you or mutilate you if you tried to escape. In France, serfs were required to get permission even to move to another village. In England, fleeing your manor could get you hunted down and dragged back, or worse, executed as a thief of your own body. Your children? They inherited your bondage automatically. The law didn't forget, and it never forgave. The legal system wasn't there to protect the weak. It was a fortress designed to trap them, generation after generation. Think marriage was a basic human right? Not if you were unfree. In many parts of medieval Europe, serfs weren't allowed to marry without their lord's consent. If you tried to marry someone from another estate, especially a free person, it wasn't seen as a romance. It was seen as theft. You were trying to steal labor from a lord's land, so the lord would demand compensation. This merchant, a fee for a daughter's marriage, could be so high that families stayed unmarried for life. Some lords even refused marriages entirely, especially if they feared they'd lose valuable workers. Worse yet, your spouse and children could be legally seized and brought back to the manor. Even love wasn't free under this system. Every bond you formed had to be bought, bargained, or broken. You might think the church would speak out against this, but for centuries they reinforced it. The church owned vast tracts of land, and with that land came thousands of serfs. Bishops and abbots weren't just spiritual leaders, they were landlords. Many lords who exploited serfs were clergy themselves. Religious texts were twisted to justify the system. The curse of Ham was used to defend hereditary servitude. The idea that suffering on earth earned reward in heaven? Perfect for keeping peasants obedient. And when some serfs tried to escape or fight back, they were excommunicated, treated as spiritual criminals. So not only were you legally bound to your master, you were told by priests that trying to break free was a sin against God. When law and faith work together, slavery becomes holy and resistance becomes heresy. Every major event in your life was controlled: birth, work, marriage, death. Even your name might be tied to your lord's estate. In many records, people weren't listed by family name, but by manorial name, identifying them as of a certain place. It was a brand disguised as location. You couldn't testify in court without your lord's approval. You couldn't own land. Even if you made money on the side, by blacksmithing, weaving, or brewing, that wealth could be taxed or seized. And if your lord sold the estate, you were sold with it. Not consulted, not informed. Just transferred like livestock. That's not feudalism. That's slavery in everything but name. Let's say you'd had enough. You ran away. You vanished into a city. That's freedom, right? Not so fast. Most cities required papers proving your freedom. If you couldn't show them, you were subject to arrest and return. Lords had bounty hunters, literally men hired to track and retrieve serfs. Even if you escaped successfully, you lived in fear. Every knock at the door could be your past catching up. You couldn't work openly. You couldn't own property legally. You existed in the cracks, constantly hiding, constantly hunted. Only after living in a city for a year and a day, without being caught, could you sometimes claim freedom. But even then, lords could sue or send thugs to bring you back by force. It wasn't just escaping land. You had to escape the law itself, a system built to find you and drag you back. Medieval slavery didn't vanish with a revolution. It morphed. Some serfs were eventually granted freedom, but often had to pay a heavy price to buy it. Others were simply absorbed into poverty, still working land they didn't own, for lords who still profited. The systems of control didn't disappear. They became more subtle, rewritten into contracts, rents, taxes, and class systems. The names changed, but the power remained. And what's most shocking, for hundreds of years, millions of people lived and died under a system where freedom was never theirs to begin with. They were born into a cage built by law, sealed by tradition, and protected by silence. Which part of this system shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. If this story made you see medieval life in a different light, give this video a like and subscribe. We're just getting started uncovering the truths buried beneath the myths.